Fog rolled in thick and heavy across the cemetery, cloaking every headstone in a ghostly shroud that seemed almost alive in the pale light of the crescent moon. The air was damp, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, mingled with the faint, metallic tang of iron from the gates that had long since begun to rust. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the ground, elongating the shapes of weathered monuments until they appeared like silent, looming sentinels. A chill wind whispered through the skeletal branches of the surrounding trees, bending them in eerie patterns and carrying a hollow moan that seemed to echo the grief of the past. At first glance, the cemetery appeared calm, frozen in its solemn stillness, yet there was an underlying tension, an invisible disturbance that hinted something was not as it seemed. The caretaker, a man who had tended the grounds for decades, stepped cautiously over uneven patches of grass, lantern in hand. Each footfall sank slightly into the moist earth, and he could hear the faint squelch of soil as if the ground itself had grown restless. His eyes scanned the rows of graves, meticulously lined and adorned with the remnants of flowers left behind by grieving families. Yet something was off. The markers that had been straight the day before now seemed subtly misaligned, leaning at angles that defied explanation. At first, he thought perhaps the soft rain had loosened the soil, or maybe small animals had disturbed the earth, but as he continued his rounds, a creeping unease settled in. Certain graves that he remembered distinctly as stable now bore fresh indentations, soil gently mounded as though the earth itself had shifted overnight. A particularly chilling discovery came when he reached the oldest section of the cemetery, where tombstones, worn and cracked by time, jutted out at odd angles. One grave, belonging to a family long gone, appeared to have rotated ever so slightly, its stone nameplate no longer aligned with the neighboring markers. The caretaker knelt beside it, running his fingers over the disturbed soil, and felt a vibration, subtle but undeniably there, like the faint heartbeat of something unseen beneath the surface. The hair on his arms stood on end, and a shiver ran down his spine as the wind seemed to intensify, carrying with it a whisper so soft that he could barely comprehend the words. The sound, or perhaps the absence of sound, was enough to make him step back and survey the area more broadly, trying to rationalize what he was witnessing, yet no logical explanation presented itself. In the distance, the faint glow of lanterns from nearby homes flickered like fireflies, but here, in the heart of the cemetery, the world felt suspended, removed from ordinary life. The caretaker's mind raced, cataloging the impossible, graves that shifted on their own, soil patterns that refused natural explanation, the absence of footprints or animal tracks near the disturbed areas. Each anomaly deepened the sense of foreboding, layering the night with tension that was almost tangible. It was as though the cemetery had become a living entity, breathing in the silence, subtly manipulating the ground, rearranging its inhabitants in a way that defied reason. He stood in the center of the oldest plot, lantern casting a flickering circle of light across the disturbed graves, and felt the weight of history pressing down on him. The wind carried a mournful sigh through the gnarled trees, brushing against his ears with uncanny familiarity, almost like a voice trying to communicate something lost to time. The caretaker realized he was not merely witnessing a natural occurrence, there was an intelligence to the disturbance, a deliberate force shaping the earth beneath his feet. Anxiety mounted, yet so did an undeniable curiosity, a morbid fascination with understanding the unknown. The night seemed endless, stretching moments into eternity, each flicker of lantern light revealing new misalignments and subtle movements among the gravestones. Every sense heightened, the caretaker noticed details he might have ignored during daylight, small depressions in the soil forming patterns, faint cracks along certain markers, the soft murmur of distant water in the background. Even the owls perched high above in the bare branches seemed restless, their calls abrupt and anxious. As he traced the perimeter of the shifting graves, he understood that this was more than mere decay or human oversight, it was a phenomenon that had begun quietly but now spoke loudly to anyone willing to notice. His breath came in short, controlled bursts, and with each step, he felt the weight of generations observing, judging, perhaps even guiding the subtle choreography of earth and stone. By the time he completed his circuit, the caretaker was both exhausted and captivated. The chill had seeped through his coat, his hands numb from the cold and the unnerving encounter. He stood silently, listening to the night, aware that the cemetery had revealed its secret only partially, teasing him with the unnatural and the inexplicable. In that moment, he realized he was a witness to something profoundly unsettling, something that transcended the boundaries of rational thought. The headstones, the soil, the wind, and the shadows, all conspired to create an atmosphere of quiet horror. Yet beneath the fear, there was a strange reverence, an acknowledgement that he was standing within a space where the ordinary laws of the world seemed to falter, leaving behind a lingering, unforgettable sense of dread that would haunt him long after he left. Nestled in a remote valley, the town surrounding the cemetery had a history as layered and shadowed as the shifting graves themselves. Established in the early 1800s by settlers seeking fertile land and religious freedom, the town grew slowly, its streets winding around small hills and streams that gave it a secluded, almost hidden quality. Cobblestone paths connected modest wooden homes, their roofs sagging under decades of snow and rain, and smoke from chimneys curled lazily into the sky, blending with morning mist. The town's architecture reflected both practicality and superstition. Carved symbols appeared above doorways, intended to ward off evil spirits or bring good fortune. Families often lived for generations in the same homes, and stories of ancestors were passed down with reverence, sometimes bordering on obsession, embedding a deep sense of continuity, and unease, within the community. At the heart of this town lay the cemetery, older than much of the surrounding settlement, its boundaries marked by a crumbling stone wall and iron gates whose hinges groaned with age. The cemetery had been meticulously expanded over the decades, each new section reflecting both the growth of the town and its shifting cultural beliefs. From the early Victorian-style monuments, adorned with angels and mourning figures, to the simpler, unadorned markers of later decades, the grounds themselves told the story of the town's evolving relationship with death. Burial practices were strict, guided by religious doctrine, and families took great care to maintain their plots, leaving fresh flowers and carved tokens to honor those who had passed. Yet beneath this outward order, there was a persistent undercurrent of superstition, stories whispered in hushed tones about graves that had moved in decades past, long dismissed as folklore, but never fully forgotten. The town's residents were a mix of pragmatic laborers, devout clergy, and quietly eccentric historians who pored over old records in search of meaning. Daily life unfolded in a rhythm punctuated by the seasons, planting and harvest, communal worship, and quiet reflection. Children played in the narrow alleys and along the edges of the cemetery, often warned not to stray too close to the older plots, where legends of restless spirits lingered. Markets and taverns served as centers of social interaction, where news and rumors traveled quickly, and yet there was a tacit agreement to treat the cemetery with a particular caution, a reverence tinged with fear. Visitors from outside the town often sensed an invisible barrier, a quiet tension in the air, as if the ground itself held secrets the locals could neither explain nor entirely ignore. Historical documents describe a pattern of minor disturbances over the decades, though these were generally attributed to natural settling, seasonal erosion, or animal activity. Letters and diaries from town elders occasionally mention the uncanny sensation of walking among graves that seemed slightly off, headstones tilted in improbable ways, or the faint impression of footprints where none could have existed. Even the most rational residents would sometimes pause at these recollections, a flicker of doubt crossing their minds, though public discussion remained rare. The cemetery's reputation as a place of mystery grew quietly, embedded within the fabric of the town's identity, shaping the way people spoke of death, the afterlife, and the unseen forces that might linger in the soil beneath their feet. The town's geography contributed to the eerie isolation of the cemetery. Hills rose sharply around the outskirts, their dense forests absorbing sound and shadow, creating a sense that the world outside the valley had little bearing on life within. Streams and small ponds reflected moonlight with an unsettling clarity, and the occasional fog would roll in from the valley floor, obscuring familiar landmarks and making navigation treacherous. Travelers and newcomers often described the sensation of stepping into a world where time moved differently, where the past and present seemed to overlap, and where the cemetery, in particular, held an almost magnetic pull. The air was thick with history, both recorded and whispered, and even ordinary events, like a storm passing through or the seasonal migration of birds, seemed imbued with portent, hinting at forces both natural and inexplicable. Religious observance was central to the town's culture, shaping both daily routines and responses to the uncanny. Church services emphasized morality, the afterlife, and divine order, offering comfort while simultaneously reinforcing the idea that any disruption to sacred spaces was inherently alarming. Clergy members often acted as mediators between rational explanations and the supernatural, attempting to provide reassurance while also maintaining authority. Families were taught from an early age to respect the boundaries of the cemetery, to honor the dead, and to be wary of disturbances that might signal moral or spiritual imbalance. This blend of reverence and fear created a fertile environment for the stories of moving graves to persist across generations, quietly influencing behavior and heightening sensitivity to the subtle anomalies that would later define the central mystery. The cemetery itself, situated just beyond the oldest homes, served as a constant reminder of mortality and the town's layered history. Paths winding between headstones bore witness to countless visits, both solemn and curious. The oldest sections were particularly evocative, with moss-covered monuments that leaned precariously, inscriptions worn nearly illegible, and statues whose stone eyes seemed to follow anyone who passed. Visitors reported a peculiar stillness in these areas, a sensation of being observed or gently guided, though never threatened. The ground's subtle irregularities, slight depressions, raised mounds, uneven alignment, were historically dismissed as erosion or settling, but in retrospect, these details hinted at something far more unsettling. The cemetery had become a living narrative of the town's history, memory, and growing unease, a place where the ordinary rituals of mourning intersected with inexplicable phenomena in ways that would challenge both reason and belief. It began with small, almost imperceptible anomalies that went unnoticed by most of the town. A slight tilt of a headstone here, a barely noticeable mound of soil there, details so minor that they could easily be dismissed as the natural settling of graves over time. Yet for those attuned to the land, especially the caretaker who had walked these grounds for decades, the changes were impossible to ignore. The soil itself seemed to resist stability, shifting subtly in ways that defied reason. Grass blades bent unnaturally, forming faint lines that hinted at movement, and even the insects and small wildlife reacted as though the cemetery had taken on a new, uncanny energy. At first, residents rationalized the occurrences as tricks of the light or effects of seasonal weather, but the frequency and consistency of the disturbances began to suggest that something far stranger was at play. Local children were among the first to notice more overt signs. They spoke in hushed tones of graves that wiggled when no one was watching, or of flowers that appeared repositioned after they had left them in place. Their parents dismissed the claims as imagination, yet a creeping unease began to take root. Farmers passing along the cemetery's boundary reported that the soil along certain rows seemed unusually loose, forming shallow ridges and depressions that could not be easily explained by animals or erosion. The subtlety of these anomalies made them all the more disturbing. They were not grand, spectacular events, but small, persistent shifts that hinted at a hidden force subtly manipulating the earth. The town's quiet rhythm was disrupted, replaced by an undercurrent of suspicion and curiosity. Witness accounts started to emerge, each adding layers to the growing mystery. A local blacksmith described arriving one morning to find his family's plot slightly misaligned, the headstone rotated just enough to unsettle him. A schoolteacher reported similar observations, noting that she had carefully placed a wreath on a grave only to find it subtly displaced the following day. Even more unsettling were descriptions of the soil itself, which some claimed felt softer or warmer in patches where movement had occurred, as though the ground were breathing. These testimonies, often dismissed initially, began to coalesce into a pattern. Anomalies were increasing in frequency, confined to certain areas, yet unpredictable in timing. Each account added weight to the suspicion that the cemetery was no longer a passive resting place but an environment in which the ordinary laws of earth and stone seemed suspended. The caretaker, increasingly vigilant, documented the anomalies meticulously, taking note of soil composition, weather patterns, and the positions of grave markers. He noted that the disturbances were most pronounced in the older sections, where monuments had weathered decades of wind, rain, and frost. Stones carved from marble and sandstone exhibited fine hairline fractures, some of which aligned unerringly with the direction of the soil shifts. He began leaving small markers and sticks in the ground to track movement overnight, only to discover them slightly displaced by morning. This meticulous observation revealed a disquieting rhythm. Movement seemed to occur during the night, often without any discernible external cause, and yet it did so with a consistency that suggested some deliberate, unseen process. As the early signs multiplied, the townspeople could no longer ignore them. Conversations in marketplaces, taverns, and church gatherings increasingly revolved around the cemetery and the inexplicable phenomena. Rumors spread quickly, that the dead were restless, that spirits of ancestors were dissatisfied, or that some curse had taken hold. The ambiguity of these explanations only intensified the anxiety. There was no concrete evidence to support any one theory, yet the growing consensus that something unusual was occurring was undeniable. Even skeptics could not deny the visual evidence of misaligned graves and disturbed soil. The tension between empirical observation and folklore began to shape the community, creating an atmosphere of nervous anticipation and subtle paranoia. Observers began to note patterns in the anomalies, though no clear logic emerged. Certain graves shifted more frequently than others, sometimes in clusters, other times in isolation. Soil mounds appeared and disappeared in irregular sequences, suggesting motion without human or animal interference. Flowers and small personal items left on graves were often found repositioned, sometimes atop other graves entirely. These inconsistencies fueled speculation, with some suggesting that natural explanations, such as underground water flows or small burrowing creatures, were insufficient. The inability to account for these subtle movements scientifically heightened the eerie sense that the cemetery was, in some inexplicable way, alive. The emotional impact of these early anomalies cannot be overstated. Families who had long visited their ancestors' graves with solemn respect found themselves unnerved by the subtle rearrangements, questioning the stability of the ground and the sanctity of their loved ones' resting places. Anxiety permeated the town, particularly among older residents who had grown up hearing cautionary tales about restless spirits and ancestral grievances. Even those who did not believe in the supernatural could not dismiss the evidence entirely, as the anomalies were tangible, measurable, and persistent. The emotional landscape of the town shifted, reverence gave way to unease, curiosity intertwined with fear, and a quiet tension threaded through everyday life. By the end of this period, the early signs of movement had established a pattern both frightening and fascinating. Subtle anomalies became the first evidence of a phenomenon that would soon grow in scale and intensity, challenging both belief and reason. The town, once confident in its orderly rituals and structured life, now faced the unnerving possibility that its cemetery was no longer a static repository of the dead, but a site of subtle, unexplained activity. As observers continued to document and report these irregularities, the stage was set for deeper investigation, and the emotional undercurrent of suspense and dread began to build, drawing the community and anyone who might witness it into a slow-burning, inexplicable mystery that would challenge perceptions of reality itself. The first witnesses to the strange disturbances in the cemetery became the unwitting chroniclers of a mystery that refused to be contained. Their accounts arrived slowly, pieced together over days, weeks, and even months, each narrative adding depth to a puzzle that had no clear edges. The earliest witnesses were often the most reluctant to speak, hesitant to invite ridicule or accusation from their neighbors. Among them was a local farmer who had walked the perimeter of his family's plots every morning for decades. He described noticing subtle tilts in the headstones that seemed to deepen each night, changes too precise and consistent to be attributed to wind or rain. His voice trembled as he recounted how the soil occasionally formed soft ridges beneath his fingers, almost as if the graves were breathing, and how flowers he had placed for his late wife were sometimes found neatly repositioned atop nearby graves. The unnerving regularity of these occurrences left him questioning not only the cemetery but also his own perception of reality. A schoolteacher, known for her careful attention to detail and methodical nature, became another early witness. She had been walking through the older sections of the cemetery during her usual afternoon stroll, noting the arrangements of tombstones, when she realized that a particular row had subtly shifted. One stone, a marker for children who had died in an epidemic decades earlier, was slightly rotated, its inscription catching the sunlight at a new angle. She recalled checking her notes from previous visits and confirming the change. It was not a dramatic movement, but its precision unsettled her deeply. The act of documenting these subtle shifts became a nightly routine for her, yet every observation reinforced the impossible: graves were moving when no human hands or known natural forces were involved. Her testimony, detailed and calm in delivery, lent credibility to the phenomenon, as she was considered rational and scientifically minded within the community. Children also played a pivotal role as witnesses, though their accounts were often dismissed at first. They spoke of wiggling graves and flowers that changed places while no one was looking. One young boy described how he saw a small mound of dirt rise and fall while hiding behind a tree, an experience that left him terrified and reluctant to return. Another child told of hearing faint whispers at dusk, as if the wind were carrying voices calling out from beneath the soil. These narratives, while initially treated as fanciful imaginings, gained significance as multiple children reported similar experiences. Their innocence and unfiltered perspective gave weight to the notion that the anomalies were real, affecting all who entered the cemetery, regardless of age or skepticism. Clergy members, too, became inadvertent witnesses. One pastor, while performing evening prayers near the oldest crypts, noted that certain headstones had shifted slightly, the change so subtle that it might have been overlooked if not for his habitual reverence for order. He observed the disturbed soil and the faint misalignment of stonework, and for the first time questioned whether human understanding, or divine order, could fully account for the events. In private, he confided his concerns to other members of the clergy, sparking quiet discussions about the morality, spirituality, and possible supernatural significance of the disturbances. His testimony highlighted the tension between faith and empirical observation, a theme that would recur as more witnesses came forward. As witness accounts multiplied, the anomalies began to form a pattern that was both confounding and specific. Certain graves appeared to shift more frequently than others, often in clusters that suggested a deliberate arrangement. Soil ridges formed in predictable yet inexplicable patterns, and objects placed atop graves, flowers, small personal tokens, even stones, were occasionally relocated with unsettling precision. Those who observed these changes described a sense of being watched, of an invisible presence orchestrating the subtle rearrangements. The psychological impact on witnesses was profound. Many reported difficulty sleeping, persistent unease, and an almost compulsive need to return to the cemetery to verify their observations. The act of witnessing became an emotional burden, transforming ordinary visits into experiences charged with anxiety and fascination. Neighbors who were not direct witnesses began to engage with the mystery through second-hand accounts, creating an atmosphere of collective attention and apprehension. Conversations in marketplaces, taverns, and church gatherings increasingly centered on the cemetery, with townspeople exchanging details, speculating on causes, and sharing personal interpretations of what they believed might be occurring. Stories circulated of graves that seemed to turn themselves, or of faint sounds beneath the soil at night, audible only to those who approached quietly. Each retelling added layers of complexity and tension, blending first-hand observation with folklore and imagination. The community, once cohesive and confident in its routines, found itself pulled into a shared experience of uncertainty and fear, where the line between rational explanation and superstition grew increasingly blurred. The town's artisans and historians began documenting the events meticulously, creating records that included diagrams, sketches, and written accounts of each reported anomaly. They measured angles of tilting headstones, catalogued soil displacement, and compared current observations with historical records. In some instances, they discovered that anomalies appeared in locations with historical significance, graves of founders, victims of old epidemics, or prominent families, which fueled speculation that the cemetery might be responding to the town's collective memory or historical energy. Such discoveries heightened the sense of the supernatural, even among those who otherwise sought logical explanations. The emotional dimension of witnessing these anomalies became increasingly central to the narrative. Families who had visited the cemetery for generations expressed a mix of fear, grief, and fascination. Caretakers described the physical and mental toll of observing graves that defied explanation, often feeling a sense of futility in maintaining order while the earth itself resisted permanence. Witnesses spoke of the surreal sensation of seeing something familiar, the resting places of loved ones, become subtly alien overnight. This emotional resonance, grounded in human experience, gave the events weight and credibility, making them compelling not only as unexplained phenomena but also as deeply affecting encounters with mortality, memory, and the limits of understanding. By the time multiple witnesses had emerged, the cemetery had transformed from a passive setting into an active stage where the ordinary and the inexplicable coexisted. The testimonies collectively painted a picture of a place both familiar and alien, a repository of memory and mystery in which the physical landscape itself seemed to participate in storytelling. Each account reinforced the others, creating a cumulative effect that drew more residents and outsiders into careful observation, discussion, and speculation. The cumulative weight of these narratives established the cemetery as a site of both psychological and cultural significance, a location where the normal rules of space, time, and mortality were challenged by subtle, persistent anomalies that demanded attention and respect. The early witnesses, in their varied roles as caretakers, teachers, children, and clergy, became the intermediaries between the ordinary world and the strange reality taking shape within the cemetery. Their observations and emotional responses laid the foundation for the growing mystery, providing both documentation and human context. The cemetery, once simply a place of rest, had begun to assert its own narrative, a silent yet powerful presence that reshaped the perceptions, beliefs, and behaviors of all who encountered it. The stage was set for broader recognition of the phenomenon, for deeper investigation, and for the tension between reason, belief, and the uncanny to escalate in ways that would challenge the town, its inhabitants, and anyone who ventured into its fog-laden grounds. The growing reports of anomalies in the cemetery quickly became a source of tension within the town, sparking debates between faith, skepticism, and social pressure. Local clergy, who had long served as both spiritual guides and community authorities, were among the first to attempt a framework of explanation. They urged calm, attributing the subtle grave movements to divine lessons or moral reflection, suggesting that perhaps the restless soil was a reminder of humanity's transience or a call to repentance. Sermons occasionally referenced the importance of vigilance in faith, emphasizing that divine order might manifest in ways beyond immediate human comprehension. Yet, while these messages offered some comfort, they also carried the unintended effect of framing the disturbances as morally or spiritually significant, increasing anxiety for families who feared their own plots might be implicated in some unseen imbalance. Skeptics, in contrast, pushed for rational explanations, pointing to environmental factors such as erosion, underground water flows, frost heave, or burrowing animals as potential causes for the observed changes. They argued that attributing the anomalies to supernatural forces was premature and could foster unnecessary fear. Public debates emerged at town gatherings, where the rational and the spiritual perspectives clashed, each side presenting evidence, anecdotes, and logical arguments. The tension between empirical reasoning and faith-driven interpretation created a cultural schism, illustrating the complexity of human response to phenomena that defied easy classification. The cemetery, once a place of quiet reflection, became a focal point for ideological conflict, where beliefs, assumptions, and fears intersected in profound ways. As the debate intensified, social pressure began to shape the way residents engaged with the cemetery. Families felt compelled to conform to communal interpretations, whether religious or scientific, and to report anomalies in ways that aligned with prevailing expectations. Those who spoke too openly about the supernatural aspects risked ridicule, while those insisting on purely rational explanations were sometimes accused of blasphemy or moral indifference. This dynamic fostered a culture of caution and selective disclosure, amplifying the psychological weight of the cemetery's mysteries. Witnesses became increasingly self-conscious, aware that their observations were filtered through a lens of communal judgment. The town's collective perception of the cemetery was thus shaped not only by what was observed but also by the pressure to interpret it in socially acceptable terms. Despite efforts to maintain order and provide reassurance, the anomalies continued and even intensified. Graves shifted more noticeably, and soil ridges formed with greater frequency and unpredictability. Residents who once walked the cemetery confidently began to approach with trepidation, noting each misalignment, each displaced token, with heightened awareness. Fear mingled with fascination, as the persistent disruption of natural order suggested a force both deliberate and inscrutable. Psychological strain became evident. Some caretakers reported sleepless nights, haunted by the thought of disturbed graves. Others experienced lingering unease, a sense of being watched even outside the cemetery. This escalation magnified the emotional stakes, reinforcing the perception that the disturbances were far from trivial. Religious interpretation and denial often intersected with social expectation in complex ways. Clergy members attempted to maintain calm by framing the cemetery's anomalies as part of divine will, encouraging prayer and ritual as forms of engagement. Certain families embraced these teachings, performing ceremonies or leaving offerings intended to placate restless spirits. Others resisted, insisting that empirical observation was the only path to understanding. This divergence intensified community tensions, with each side questioning the moral, spiritual, or intellectual rigor of the other. The interplay of faith and denial became a central feature of the town's response, highlighting the intricate ways in which human psychology interacts with the unexplained. Within households, anxiety over the cemetery affected daily life. Parents cautioned children against wandering near older graves, recounting tales of restless spirits and unseen forces. Caretakers adjusted routines, spending more time monitoring the grounds and meticulously documenting any changes. Social gatherings increasingly included discussions of the cemetery's anomalies, and ordinary topics became intertwined with speculation about supernatural influence or moral consequence. The pervasiveness of fear and fascination altered the town's cultural rhythm, as ordinary life became inseparable from the mystery that had quietly taken hold in the landscape. Attempts to rationalize the phenomena often collided with emotional reality. Even those committed to scientific reasoning found themselves unsettled by the persistent movement of graves, the subtle yet deliberate patterns of soil displacement, and the relocation of personal items left on plots. The cemetery's behavior defied predictable natural laws, creating cognitive dissonance among observers who were otherwise rational and skeptical. This tension between logic and perception amplified the community's unease, forcing residents to grapple with uncertainty and the limits of human understanding. Psychological strain mounted as individuals attempted to reconcile the tangible evidence of shifting graves with the impossibility of a clear cause. Stories began to circulate of unusual sensory experiences at the cemetery, whispers carried on the wind, shadows that moved independently of light sources, and subtle shifts in temperature that seemed localized to particular graves. Witnesses reported a feeling of presence, as if unseen observers were monitoring human activity. The combination of physical anomalies and perceived sensations contributed to a sense of moral and spiritual urgency. People wondered whether the disturbances were warnings, manifestations of guilt, or signs of cosmic imbalance. These interpretations, though unprovable, shaped behavior and social interaction, reinforcing the cemetery's role as a locus of tension and reflection. The psychological and social impact of the cemetery's anomalies reached a turning point when even the most skeptical residents acknowledged the persistence of unexplained phenomena. Families began visiting the cemetery less frequently, and the once vibrant community of caretakers shrank as individuals struggled to reconcile fear with duty. Rumors of restless spirits and hidden forces became embedded in local lore, influencing behavior, storytelling, and cultural memory. The town found itself caught between denial, rationalization, and the acknowledgement of a mystery that neither faith nor science could fully explain. The cemetery had become both a site of observation and a mirror of human emotion, reflecting the community's anxieties, beliefs, and limitations. By the conclusion of this period, the town had adapted to a fragile coexistence with uncertainty. The clergy continued to emphasize faith and moral reflection, while rationalists documented anomalies with increasing diligence. Residents navigated the tension between skepticism and belief, balancing fear with curiosity, and private observation with public expectation. The cemetery, far from being a neutral resting place, had asserted itself as an active participant in the town's emotional and social life, shaping perceptions, dictating behavior, and embedding itself deeply into the cultural consciousness. Its disturbances were no longer merely physical phenomena, they had become catalysts for psychological reflection, communal debate, and enduring mystery. As the subtle shifts and anomalies in the cemetery grew more frequent, the atmosphere among the townspeople shifted from quiet unease to pervasive anxiety. Families began to speak openly about the disturbances, their conversations tinged with fear and fascination, while the initial curiosity gave way to a creeping sense of dread. Graves that had once seemed stable now displayed movements that were impossible to ignore. Headstones tilted at unusual angles, soil mounds rose overnight, and personal items left on the graves were often found displaced. The community's collective attention sharpened, each resident watching for signs of change, each footstep on the cemetery's pathways accompanied by a heightened sense of anticipation. Even casual visitors described a strange tension in the air, as if the land itself had become charged with an energy that resisted ordinary understanding. The emotional toll on those who frequently visited the cemetery became apparent. Caretakers, who had long been accustomed to the rhythm of tending graves and maintaining order, found themselves increasingly unnerved. Sleepless nights were common, filled with the fear that the graves might shift under the cover of darkness in ways too subtle or precise to be accidental. Parents began to warn children not to stray near certain plots, recounting whispered stories of moving graves and unseen presences. Witnesses described an almost obsessive need to monitor the cemetery, to ensure that the memory and dignity of the dead were preserved, even as the soil itself seemed determined to resist their efforts. This blend of duty, fear, and fascination created a psychological tension that spread throughout the community, subtly reshaping daily routines and interactions. Rumors of the anomalies began to circulate beyond first-hand witnesses, reaching even those who rarely visited the cemetery. Some spoke of shadows moving independently of natural light sources, faint murmurs carried on the wind, and a sensation that the earth itself was shifting beneath their feet. These accounts, while anecdotal, added a layer of emotional and psychological weight to the ongoing mystery. The townspeople became hyper-aware of the cemetery's presence in their lives, noticing subtle sounds, sudden chills, and fleeting glimpses of movement that might have gone unnoticed before. The blending of tangible phenomena with sensory perception heightened the emotional impact, reinforcing the idea that the cemetery was no longer a passive resting place but a locus of tension and unease. Attempts to physically monitor the cemetery were met with frustration and growing disquiet. Caretakers placed markers to track the position of headstones, measured soil displacement, and kept detailed journals of nightly observations. Despite these meticulous efforts, the anomalies persisted, often moving in patterns that defied expectation. Some graves shifted incrementally each night, others appeared to rotate slightly, and soil ridges formed and disappeared without discernible cause. This unpredictability fueled a sense of helplessness among observers, reinforcing the psychological impact of the disturbances. The cemetery had begun to assert control over the perception and experience of those who entered it, shaping the emotional and intellectual responses of the town in ways that could not be ignored. The escalation of activity also led to visible social consequences. Families limited visits to the cemetery, fearing both the physical movement of graves and the psychological strain of witnessing unexplained phenomena. Social gatherings increasingly included discussions about the anomalies, blending fact, observation, and speculation in ways that heightened collective anxiety. The town's rhythm of daily life was subtly altered. Workers approached their routines with a persistent awareness of the cemetery's presence, and children were kept under closer supervision during play. The ordinary fabric of community life was interwoven with fear, fascination, and the lingering awareness of forces beyond comprehension. In some cases, residents reported physical sensations associated with the anomalies. Sudden drops in temperature near certain graves, inexplicable breezes in otherwise still air, and the sensation of being watched were commonly described. These experiences, while subjective, contributed to the narrative of the cemetery as a psychologically active space, a place that exerted influence over both perception and emotion. The combination of tangible shifts in the soil and subjective sensations created a layered experience that was both unsettling and compelling, reinforcing the mystery and compelling continued observation. Attempts at explanation, whether through scientific reasoning or spiritual interpretation, began to collide with the emotional weight of the situation. Rational observers, including visiting scholars and local investigators, attempted to attribute the disturbances to underground water movement, frost heave, or structural weaknesses in grave construction. Yet these theories were consistently challenged by the precision and regularity of the movements, as well as by accounts of sensory anomalies that defied empirical measurement. Simultaneously, religious interpretations framed the cemetery as a site of moral or spiritual significance, suggesting that restless spirits, divine messages, or ancestral energy might be at work. The tension between rational explanation and emotional perception deepened the sense of suspense, leaving the town caught between belief, doubt, and fear. As nights passed and anomalies persisted, the psychological strain intensified. Witnesses described recurring dreams in which graves shifted, or the feeling that the cemetery extended beyond its physical boundaries, encroaching into their waking lives. Caretakers reported fatigue, anxiety, and a subtle, gnawing dread that accompanied each visit. Children became fearful of approaching the older plots, and families debated whether to continue maintaining graves at all. The cemetery, through subtle physical and psychological cues, had begun to shape behavior and perception on a profound level, embedding itself into the consciousness of the town. By the conclusion of this period, the cumulative effect of escalating anomalies and the emotional impact on the townspeople had transformed the cemetery from a quiet resting place into a site of pervasive tension and psychological strain. The once ordinary landscape had become charged with significance, both physical and emotional, compelling careful observation, speculation, and reflection. The community's experience illustrated the interplay between tangible phenomena, human perception, and emotional response, creating a slow-burning sense of dread that would prepare the stage for the next phase of mystery, investigation, and increasingly pronounced disruption in the lives of all who came into contact with the cemetery. As the cemetery's anomalies persisted, the town began to seek rational explanations in earnest, turning to scholars, geologists, and visiting investigators who promised empirical clarity in the face of growing unease. Experts were called to examine soil composition, underground water channels, and the structural integrity of the graves themselves, hoping to uncover patterns that could account for the subtle yet consistent movements. They conducted measurements, analyzed soil density, and mapped the positions of headstones, yet each meticulous examination yielded more questions than answers. The ground in some sections was unusually soft, while other areas remained hard and unyielding, and the apparent precision of the movements defied conventional understanding of natural processes. Every test, every measurement, seemed to reinforce the impossibility of the events, suggesting that the cemetery's behavior operated outside the bounds of ordinary explanation. Investigators explored a variety of natural hypotheses, beginning with soil instability. They examined underground water flows, considering whether seasonal flooding or hidden streams might cause uneven settling. Frost heave, the expansion of frozen ground during winter months, was also analyzed, as were subterranean animal activities, such as burrowing rodents or insects disturbing the soil. Each theory was tested with careful observation, probes, and measurements, yet anomalies persisted in ways that could not be consistently linked to any single factor. Some graves shifted while nearby plots remained entirely undisturbed, soil ridges formed and dissipated unpredictably, and items placed atop graves were relocated with precision that natural forces alone could not explain. The investigators found themselves confronting a mystery that challenged both the limits of their knowledge and the reliability of conventional scientific methods. Despite the rigor of these studies, psychological and social factors complicated the investigation. Witnesses, anxious and emotionally invested, often unintentionally influenced observations. Caretakers and family members meticulously documented changes, sometimes exaggerating subtle shifts in their desire to explain the inexplicable. At the same time, anecdotal reports of whispers, shadows, and sudden temperature changes persisted, adding layers of complexity that empirical methods could not capture. The combination of tangible soil disturbances and subjective sensory experiences created a scenario in which science, observation, and human perception intersected, yet failed to produce definitive answers. Investigators began to acknowledge the limits of conventional explanation, grappling with a phenomenon that blurred the lines between physical reality and psychological perception. Geologists conducted soil core sampling to examine density, moisture content, and composition, discovering variations that were insufficient to account for the scale and precision of movements observed. Subsurface cavities, thought to potentially contribute to instability, were largely absent, and no evidence of significant erosion or animal activity could account for the patterns recorded. Engineers tested the stability of headstones, calculating angles, weight distribution, and material strength, yet even these calculations failed to predict or explain the incremental rotations, tilts, and subtle displacements observed. Each empirical failure reinforced the sense that the cemetery's anomalies were not merely natural, but part of an intricate pattern that eluded conventional reasoning. Historians and archivists joined the effort, combing through town records, burial logs, and correspondence to identify correlations that might illuminate the behavior of the cemetery. They discovered references to minor disturbances over the decades, often dismissed at the time as folklore, erosion, or accidents. Patterns emerged: graves of historically significant families, victims of epidemics, and those buried in particularly old sections seemed more prone to movement. While these observations did not provide causal explanation, they suggested that the anomalies were not entirely random, hinting at an underlying principle or influence yet to be understood. Such historical analysis reinforced both the scientific and psychological dimensions of the mystery, bridging empirical observation with cultural memory. The emotional response of those involved in the investigations also became a notable factor. Caretakers, families, and even visiting scholars reported fatigue, heightened anxiety, and a subtle unease that intensified with prolonged exposure to the cemetery. Observers described a creeping dread, as if the environment itself resisted explanation, challenging rational thought and eliciting visceral emotional reactions. The cemetery, through its persistent anomalies, had begun to assert a psychological influence over those who attempted to study it, creating a feedback loop in which observation fueled anxiety, and anxiety intensified the perception of irregularities. This interplay between objective investigation and emotional response added a layer of complexity to the search for understanding. Religious and cultural interpretations continued to intersect with scientific inquiry. Clergy members, while encouraging empirical analysis, maintained that the disturbances could also carry moral or spiritual significance. Families performed rituals, placed offerings, and conducted prayers intended to restore balance, while investigators attempted to measure and document each occurrence. This dual approach highlighted the coexistence of belief and reason, illustrating how human attempts to understand phenomena often require navigating multiple explanatory frameworks simultaneously. The cemetery became a focal point not only for empirical study but also for reflection on mortality, morality, and the unknown. Over time, investigators recognized that the anomalies resisted categorization and defied linear explanation. The cemetery's behavior seemed to operate according to a logic inaccessible to conventional methods, blending precise physical shifts with subtle sensory phenomena and psychological impact. Each attempt to explain the movement scientifically produced partial understanding at best, while simultaneously reinforcing the impression of a site governed by forces beyond ordinary perception. Witnesses, caretakers, and scholars alike came to acknowledge that the mystery was not merely a technical problem but a phenomenon that encompassed history, culture, and human experience. By the conclusion of this phase, the cemetery had become a laboratory of sorts, where empirical observation, historical research, and human emotion intersected without resolution. The precision of grave movements, the unpredictability of soil changes, and the persistence of unexplained phenomena created a landscape that challenged conventional understanding. Investigators, despite their expertise, confronted the limits of knowledge, while residents grappled with the emotional and psychological consequences of witnessing events that could not be fully rationalized. The cemetery, through both physical disruption and the weight of human perception, had established itself as a site where reason, belief, and mystery coexisted in tension, setting the stage for the deeper, more unsettling phases of its enigmatic influence. As the anomalies in the cemetery persisted, the psychological and emotional strain on the townspeople intensified, reaching a point where ordinary routines were increasingly disrupted. Residents who once approached the grounds with solemnity now did so with trepidation, noticing every subtle shift, every irregularity in the soil, and every misaligned headstone. Children were warned not to wander too close, their curiosity tempered by the stories whispered by elders, while adults approached visits with a mixture of duty and dread. Even casual passers-by reported feeling an almost tangible tension in the air, as if the cemetery itself exhaled unease. The quiet, measured rhythm of daily life was replaced by heightened awareness and constant anticipation, as the community collectively adjusted to the reality that the cemetery no longer conformed to ordinary expectations of stillness and permanence. The cumulative psychological impact was profound. Caretakers reported insomnia, persistent anxiety, and a sense of futility, as if their efforts to maintain order were being subtly undermined by an unseen force. Families experienced unease that extended beyond the cemetery, noticing displacements of small items, subtle shifts in the home environment, and an almost constant feeling of being observed. The emotional weight of these experiences created a pervasive atmosphere of tension, blending fear, fascination, and helplessness. Townspeople who had previously dismissed stories of moving graves now spoke cautiously and deliberately, aware that the phenomenon was neither random nor trivial. The cemetery, through its persistent anomalies, had become an agent of psychological influence, shaping behavior, perception, and emotional state across the community. Local folklore, long whispered in hushed tones, began to regain prominence in the interpretation of these events. Stories of restless spirits, ancestral guardians, and moral retribution resurfaced, framed by the undeniable physical evidence of shifting graves and displaced items. Elders recounted tales passed down through generations, emphasizing that cemeteries were places where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin, and where unusual occurrences were often signs of deeper truths. Children, already sensitized by parental warnings, repeated these stories, reinforcing the communal belief in unseen forces at work. Even those who leaned toward rational explanations began to consider that cultural memory and spiritual interpretation might hold kernels of insight into the inexplicable behaviors observed within the cemetery's grounds. The cemetery's anomalies also began to affect social dynamics within the town. Families debated how to respond, whether to continue tending graves meticulously or to limit interaction out of fear of provoking further disturbances. Disagreements arose between those advocating empirical observation and those emphasizing spiritual caution, creating subtle tensions within the community. Public gatherings, which had previously focused on routine matters, became spaces where discussions of cemetery anomalies intertwined with moral, spiritual, and practical considerations. The cemetery's influence extended beyond its physical boundaries, shaping not only behavior within its gates but also social interaction, decision-making, and cultural consciousness throughout the town. As the disturbances became more pronounced, observers noted patterns that deepened the sense of unease. Certain graves shifted with surprising regularity, while adjacent plots remained undisturbed. Soil ridges appeared in sequences that suggested deliberate organization, and items placed atop graves were sometimes relocated in ways that implied intention rather than random movement. These observations, meticulously recorded by caretakers and visiting investigators, reinforced the notion that the cemetery was not simply experiencing natural settling or environmental disruption. Instead, it seemed to operate according to a logic that was both precise and enigmatic, eliciting a sense of awe and apprehension among witnesses. The psychological dimension of these experiences cannot be overstated. Caretakers described feeling a persistent, almost magnetic pull toward the cemetery, an irresistible need to monitor the grounds despite the stress and fear it engendered. Families expressed anxiety that extended into dreams and waking hours, with some reporting recurring visions of shifting graves or an intangible presence observing their actions. This pervasive influence affected the town's collective consciousness, blurring the boundary between reality and perception, and creating a heightened sensitivity to anomalies both within and beyond the cemetery. The environment itself seemed to shape thought and emotion, amplifying fear, fascination, and the sense of inevitability surrounding the phenomenon. Religious and cultural interpretation continued to intersect with empirical observation. Clergy encouraged prayer and ritual, asserting that spiritual engagement could placate restless forces, while scientists and rational observers maintained meticulous records of anomalies. This dual approach reflected the community's struggle to reconcile reason with belief, observation with intuition, and empirical data with emotional experience. The cemetery became a site where multiple layers of understanding, historical, cultural, spiritual, and scientific, coexisted, each offering partial insight while simultaneously underscoring the limitations of human comprehension. The interplay between fear, fascination, and observation led to a feedback loop that intensified the anomaly's perceived influence. Heightened vigilance resulted in more detailed documentation, while detailed documentation heightened awareness of subtle movements and irregularities. Social and psychological tension escalated as more residents became attuned to the cemetery's unusual behavior, reinforcing the perception that the site was both active and deliberate in its disturbances. Each new observation, whether by caretaker, family member, or casual visitor, fed into the collective consciousness of the town, creating an environment in which the extraordinary was expected and ordinary perception was continually challenged. By the conclusion of this phase, the cemetery had transformed from a passive resting place into a locus of psychological, social, and cultural activity. The persistent movement of graves, the subtle rearrangement of objects, and the sensory anomalies reported by witnesses created a multifaceted mystery that engaged the community on multiple levels. Fear, fascination, and reverence intertwined, shaping behavior, influencing social dynamics, and embedding the cemetery deeply into the town's collective consciousness. The stage was set for further escalation, as the physical, emotional, and cultural implications of the anomalies would continue to unfold, drawing the town into a deeper engagement with the unexplained forces at work within the cemetery's grounds. As the anomalies in the cemetery persisted and intensified, the town's sense of security began to erode, replaced by a pervasive feeling of isolation and vulnerability. Residents who once approached the cemetery with routine reverence now did so with a mixture of dread and fascination, each visit layered with anticipation of subtle changes. The shifts of headstones, the displaced soil, and the rearranged personal items were no longer occasional curiosities, they had become a regular, almost nightly occurrence. Caretakers, families, and local officials alike found themselves tethered to the cemetery by both duty and fear, their routines increasingly dictated by the need to monitor, document, and interpret the inexplicable movements that seemed to defy every natural law they understood. Isolation became a psychological byproduct of the disturbances. Families began to limit visits, particularly during dusk and nighttime, when the cemetery's unusual energy seemed most pronounced. Children were warned repeatedly not to stray near older plots, reinforcing a sense of danger and the idea that some forces were beyond comprehension. Even casual passers-by reported an oppressive tension in the air, as if the landscape itself were watching, waiting, and subtly influencing perception. The town, once tightly knit through daily interaction and shared labor, found its communal fabric strained, as fear and fascination regarding the cemetery's behavior created both unity and division among its residents. Observers noted that the disturbances were no longer confined to subtle movements, certain graves exhibited more dramatic shifts, including noticeable tilting of headstones and rearrangement of soil that suggested a deliberate pattern rather than random settling. Personal items left on graves, flowers, stones, small mementos, were consistently displaced, sometimes relocated to adjacent plots or seemingly rotated in alignment with neighboring graves. These developments intensified the psychological impact on residents, heightening their sense that the cemetery itself was an active participant in an unseen narrative. The interplay between physical anomalies and human perception reinforced a collective anxiety, leaving individuals questioning the boundaries of reality and the reliability of their own senses. The town's social dynamics were further affected as discussions of the cemetery's behavior dominated public and private discourse. Families debated the appropriate level of engagement with the site, with some advocating for cautious observation and meticulous documentation, while others urged distance and reliance on faith or ritual to placate restless forces. Church services increasingly incorporated references to the cemetery's anomalies, framing them as moral or spiritual lessons, while skeptics challenged the framing of these events as supernatural, emphasizing the need for rational inquiry. The tension between empirical observation and cultural interpretation created a charged environment, where fear, fascination, and moral reflection were constantly intertwined. Psychological effects on witnesses became more pronounced. Caretakers described sleepless nights, persistent anxiety, and an almost compulsive need to monitor the grounds for further disturbances. Families reported heightened sensitivity to subtle environmental changes, including sudden chills, faint breezes in still air, and inexplicable shadows that appeared to move independently of natural light sources. Even those who approached the cemetery with skepticism found themselves experiencing unease, a creeping dread that suggested the cemetery's influence extended beyond mere physical displacement. The emotional landscape of the town was thus reshaped by the interplay of tangible anomalies and human perception, creating a persistent sense of vulnerability and uncertainty. Investigators, both local and visiting, continued to examine the cemetery with scientific rigor, yet each observation only deepened the sense of mystery. Soil analyses revealed variations that could not account for the pattern and precision of movements. Measurements of headstones and grave alignments demonstrated consistency in shifts that defied natural explanation. Historical records were cross-referenced with current anomalies, uncovering correlations between older, historically significant graves and more frequent disturbances. While these studies did not yield definitive explanations, they reinforced the perception that the cemetery was governed by rules outside ordinary understanding, combining physical movement with psychological resonance in ways that challenged conventional frameworks. Folklore and cultural interpretation gained renewed significance in this climate of heightened tension. Tales of restless spirits, ancestral guardians, and moral retribution were invoked to contextualize the increasingly dramatic disturbances. Elder residents recounted generations-old stories that framed cemeteries as liminal spaces, where the living and dead intersected and where unusual occurrences signaled moral, spiritual, or ancestral warnings. Children, sensitized by repeated cautionary instruction, internalized these narratives, reinforcing communal belief in unseen forces while amplifying the psychological impact of observation. These cultural dimensions interwove with empirical documentation, creating a layered understanding of the cemetery as both a physical and symbolic locus of power and mystery. The growing scale of anomalies led some residents to limit interaction with the cemetery entirely. Families ceased tending certain plots, relying on distance and faith rather than active engagement, while others remained committed to careful observation, feeling an obligation to preserve both memory and dignity in the face of inexplicable movement. The resulting behavioral divergence created subtle social fractures, as differing interpretations of appropriate response, faith, science, ritual, or observation, highlighted contrasting approaches to uncertainty and the unknown. In this environment, the cemetery exerted influence not only through physical phenomena but also through the shaping of social and psychological dynamics. By the conclusion of this period, the cemetery had evolved from a site of minor curiosity into a profound source of isolation, tension, and psychological strain. The persistent movement of graves, coupled with sensory anomalies and the cumulative weight of social and cultural interpretation, had transformed the town's relationship with its surroundings. Residents navigated a landscape in which the ordinary rhythms of life were increasingly defined by the cemetery's influence, where perception, emotion, and behavior were intertwined with phenomena that defied rational explanation. The stage was set for the subsequent escalation of mystery, as the cemetery's enigmatic activity prepared to confront the town with challenges that would test faith, reason, and human resilience alike. The cumulative strain of unexplained activity within the cemetery reached a point where rational explanation, folklore, and emotional response collided, creating an atmosphere of pervasive uncertainty. Families who had once engaged with the cemetery routinely now approached with a combination of fear and ritualized caution. Caretakers meticulously documented every subtle tilt of a headstone, every mound of soil that appeared overnight, and each personal item that had been displaced. Visitors described a constant, almost electric tension in the air, a feeling that the cemetery was not simply a passive resting place but a space charged with unseen energy. This heightened awareness extended beyond the cemetery itself, coloring daily life and influencing behavior in ways that were both subtle and profound. As anomalies became more pronounced, the community faced increasing psychological pressure. Witnesses reported persistent anxiety, sleep disturbances, and a recurring sense that the cemetery was observing them. Children described fleeting shadows and whispers, while adults experienced sensations of sudden cold or inexplicable movement in peripheral vision. Even the most skeptical observers could not entirely dismiss the evidence. Graves shifted with uncanny precision, soil ridges formed and disappeared in patterns, and personal effects were relocated in ways that suggested deliberate intent rather than randomness. The cemetery's influence extended into the emotional and cognitive lives of the town, creating a feedback loop in which observation heightened anxiety, and anxiety intensified perception of anomalies. At this stage, social dynamics were profoundly affected. Families debated whether to continue regular visits, with some advocating for distance and reliance on faith or ritual, and others insisting on continued observation and documentation. Clergy offered guidance, framing the disturbances as moral or spiritual messages, while rational observers emphasized natural and scientific explanations, including soil instability, frost heave, or animal activity. The tension between these perspectives fostered both communal discussion and subtle division, as differing beliefs about the cemetery's nature and proper engagement shaped behavior and interaction. Public gatherings often became spaces where these debates unfolded, blending practical concern with moral reflection and speculation. Investigators, increasingly determined to understand the phenomenon, intensified their efforts. Soil samples were collected across multiple sections, headstone alignments were meticulously measured, and patterns of movement were mapped with precise notation. Yet the anomalies persisted, often defying any clear logic. Some graves shifted repeatedly in ways that suggested deliberate orchestration, while adjacent plots remained untouched. Personal items were moved with a precision that hinted at intentional placement rather than random displacement. Historical records were cross-referenced to identify possible correlations, revealing that older, historically significant graves were more frequently affected. Despite these efforts, no definitive explanation emerged, highlighting the limitations of conventional methods in the face of a phenomenon that combined physical, psychological, and cultural dimensions. The emotional resonance of the cemetery's activity deepened during this period. Witnesses described a growing sense of urgency, as though the cemetery were asserting influence not only over physical objects but also over thought, perception, and behavior. Caretakers reported compulsive monitoring, driven by fear that even minor neglect could exacerbate the anomalies. Families expressed unease that extended into dreams and waking hours, experiencing recurring visions of shifting graves or subtle presences. Children, already primed by parental warnings and local folklore, internalized these narratives, amplifying the collective perception of the cemetery as an active, sentient environment. The interplay between observation, emotion, and behavior reinforced the sense that the cemetery's influence was multidimensional and unavoidable. Folklore and historical interpretation continued to shape understanding and response. Stories of restless spirits, ancestral guardians, and moral retribution gained renewed significance, contextualizing the increasingly dramatic disturbances. Elders recounted generational narratives of cemeteries as liminal spaces, where the living and dead intersected and where unusual occurrences conveyed warnings or messages. Cultural memory intertwined with empirical observation, creating a layered comprehension of the cemetery as both physical and symbolic. Even skeptics were forced to consider that these narratives might hold insight into patterns of movement and perception, illustrating the complexity of interpreting phenomena that straddle tangible and intangible realms. The cemetery's escalating activity also influenced behavior outside its physical boundaries. Residents adjusted routines, avoided certain areas at specific times, and conducted careful observation of even minor environmental changes. The boundaries between daily life and cemetery observation blurred, as the community's attention remained tethered to a site whose activity defied conventional understanding. Conversations in homes, marketplaces, and public gatherings increasingly incorporated discussion of subtle shifts, mysterious sounds, and unusual sensations, embedding the cemetery deeply into the town's cultural consciousness. This shared focus amplified both fear and fascination, creating a collective engagement with the unexplained that transcended individual experience. Despite ongoing investigation and cultural interpretation, the cemetery remained an enigma, its anomalies intensifying the psychological, social, and emotional stakes. Residents were compelled to navigate uncertainty, balancing fear, fascination, and moral reflection with practical considerations of observation and preservation. The cemetery, through persistent movement, sensory anomalies, and historical resonance, had become an active agent in shaping perception, behavior, and community dynamics. Its presence extended beyond the physical realm, influencing thought, emotion, and social interaction in ways that were both subtle and profound. By the conclusion of this period, the cemetery had transformed into a multidimensional site of tension, where empirical observation, cultural memory, and emotional experience intersected without resolution. The persistent disturbances, the sensory phenomena, and the psychological impact of witnessing these events had embedded the cemetery into the consciousness of the town. Residents were simultaneously compelled to observe, to interpret, and to respond, navigating an environment where the ordinary rules of space, stability, and perception no longer applied. The stage was set for the cemetery's influence to reach its most intense phase, challenging faith, reason, and human resilience in ways that would leave lasting impressions on all who encountered its enigmatic presence. The culmination of the cemetery's persistent anomalies brought the town to a state of heightened tension and reflection, where the boundaries between observation, belief, and psychological impact became increasingly blurred. By this stage, the subtle movements of graves, the displaced soil, and the rearrangement of personal items had escalated to a level that could no longer be ignored or rationalized away. Caretakers, families, and town officials approached the cemetery with a mixture of dread, duty, and fascination, compelled to witness and document events that defied conventional explanation. The community's collective consciousness had become entwined with the cemetery itself, as each anomaly resonated through the social fabric, influencing behavior, thought, and emotional state. Witnesses continued to report a variety of phenomena, both physical and sensory. Headstones tilted and rotated with precision, soil ridges appeared and disappeared seemingly at will, and objects left on graves were relocated with deliberate intent. Many described feeling an invisible presence, a sense of being observed or guided by forces beyond human perception. Children recounted whispers and shadows, adults reported sudden chills and unexplainable sensations, and even the most skeptical observers admitted to a creeping unease. This combination of tangible evidence and subjective experience reinforced the perception that the cemetery was more than a resting place, it was an active, sentient environment whose influence extended far beyond its physical boundaries. The psychological effects on the community were profound. Caretakers reported exhaustion from prolonged vigilance, families expressed anxiety that persisted into dreams and waking hours, and the general population experienced a heightened state of alertness whenever near the cemetery. Individuals described a compulsion to monitor the grounds, as if neglecting observation might exacerbate the anomalies or provoke an unseen force. The cemetery had become a psychological actor in its own right, shaping thought, emotion, and behavior through the subtle interplay of physical disruption and sensory perception. This persistent influence challenged the community's understanding of normalcy and stability, creating a pervasive atmosphere of tension and uncertainty. Historical context added another layer to the complexity of interpretation. Archivists and local historians noted that certain graves, particularly those of prominent families, epidemic victims, and older sections of the cemetery, were disproportionately affected. Records revealed minor disturbances dating back decades, often dismissed at the time as folklore, natural settling, or accidents. The alignment of historical significance with the frequency and intensity of anomalies suggested an underlying order or influence that transcended random occurrence. This connection between past and present reinforced the cemetery's cultural and emotional weight, embedding the mystery within both memory and lived experience. Religious and cultural perspectives continued to shape the community's response. Clergy emphasized spiritual engagement, prayer, and ritual as means of interacting with potentially restless forces. Families conducted ceremonies, left offerings, and observed moral reflection as part of their approach to the cemetery, framing anomalies as both lessons and warnings. Simultaneously, scientific observers meticulously documented physical changes, soil composition, and grave alignment, striving to identify patterns that could offer rational explanation. The coexistence of these frameworks highlighted the interplay between belief and reason, demonstrating the multidimensional nature of human attempts to comprehend phenomena that defy simple categorization. Social dynamics were also deeply affected. Divergent interpretations of the cemetery's activity, faith-based, scientific, or folkloric, led to subtle divisions within the town, as individuals and families navigated the tension between skepticism, fear, and devotion. Public discourse increasingly revolved around the cemetery, embedding it into daily life and communal consciousness. Families altered routines to accommodate observation, children were trained in cautionary practices, and casual conversation frequently referenced anomalies, demonstrating how a single site could influence collective behavior, thought, and emotional tone. The combination of persistent physical anomalies, cultural interpretation, and psychological impact created an environment in which the ordinary rules of life were continually challenged. Residents described a sense of inevitability, as if the cemetery's movements and disturbances were an ongoing narrative in which they were both observers and participants. Dreams, visions, and unexplainable sensations became intertwined with daily experience, reinforcing the perception that the cemetery's influence was both immediate and enduring. The community's consciousness had, in effect, become inseparable from the cemetery itself, as every subtle shift resonated through social, emotional, and perceptual channels. By the final phase, the cemetery had asserted itself as a locus of unresolved mystery, where rational explanation, cultural interpretation, and emotional resonance coexisted without resolution. The persistence of movement, the precision of alterations, and the psychological impact on witnesses made clear that this was a phenomenon operating beyond ordinary understanding. Residents navigated a complex landscape of observation, belief, and emotional engagement, simultaneously compelled to witness, to interpret, and to respond. The cemetery's anomalies had transformed it from a passive resting place into an active participant in the lives of all who encountered it, shaping perception, behavior, and social dynamics in ways that were both subtle and profound. Ultimately, the cemetery left a legacy that extended beyond immediate observation. Its disturbances became woven into local history, folklore, and memory, influencing generations and embedding themselves into the cultural consciousness. While rational explanation, scientific observation, and spiritual interpretation all offered partial understanding, the full extent of the cemetery's activity remained elusive. Its influence, both physical and psychological, persisted as a testament to the limits of human comprehension and the enduring power of mystery. In this way, the cemetery stood as a silent yet powerful witness to the interplay between life, death, memory, and the inexplicable forces that shape human experience, leaving questions that would linger long after the immediate phenomena had been observed.